Thank you for joining us today. Hello, hello, and welcome. How are we today? Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us, everyone, on this free stream for Key Stage 5 students, as well as anyone who would like to learn. Today we will be carrying on with our third lesson about The Great Gatsby, which will be focusing on the characterization of Nick Carraway, our narrator, arguably a protagonist, arguably our sort of conscience of the novel as well. IGCSE, thank you for joining us. Lovely to see you. Happy half term if you're on half term as well. Happy Lunar New Year to those who celebrate. Happy Ash Wednesday to those who celebrate. Ramadan Mubarak to those who celebrate as well. It's a very celebratory time that we're having this lesson today. If this is your first lesson with us, we will be carrying on with a study of The Great Gatsby. And if you like, there are two other lessons introducing the text and the context of the novel in my channel, Eleanor Does English, as well as introduction further to the plot, the genre, and modern tragedy, as well as different series on Othello and on A Streetcar Named Desire for your drama section. And now we are on prose, as you know. You're welcome. Hello, Willow. Thank you for joining us. Break is good. Our break for my Ed Space will be next week, so there won't be a lesson next week because we'll be breaking. Our half term is a little bit different than quite a few people's. Most people's is this week, ours is next week, so you get a bit of a break as you adjust back into your half term. If you are joining at school, if you're self-studying or being homeschooled, then at least you do still get a bit of a break in your schedule to accommodate for the other parts of your life you need to focus on of a Wednesday. So let's get started. We are going to be looking at Nick Carraway, as I said. In our focus, we will be looking in terms of characters at Nick, as well as Gatsby and Daisy, and then we'll be focusing on some themes. Okay, so let's get started. If this is your first stream with me, I'm Eleanor. I'm one of the teachers at my EdSpace. I have been offering free streams for Key Stage 5 since September of this year, and at my EdSpace we hope to be bringing loads of the subjects that you are studying as free streams on the topics that you need to know, adding depth and breadth to your study as well. So hopefully you will be able to see much more of me as well as your other My EdSpace teachers on free streams across the year. So let's start with brainstorming about Nick Carraway, shall we? And what we know about him as a character. So put into the chat if you like, or double check your answers, or follow along with us on your own mind map and your own notes. What do we know about Nick Carraway, or how he is presented in the text? Let's see. Feel free to type into the chat. So one of the first things we know about Nick is that he calls himself honest here. And we do have this view of him presented as honest, or perhaps as realistic, particularly in comparison to Gatsby. So he's this kind of antithesis to Gatsby here. And he claims, as Willow said, absolutely to be unbiased, but is actually very judgmental. He said he disapproved of Gatsby. We can call him elitist. We can call him an element of this upper class society. and much more in line with Daisy. He's a cousin of Daisy's, remember? And he also went to Yale with Tom. So I'll actually write that the other way around. Tom is a classmate of his at Yale. So blood relation to elite and elite institutions. Remember, at this time, only upper class men really were allowed access to spaces like Yale. And F. Scott Fitzgerald, who went to Princeton, said despite his connections to at least certainly upper middle class society, he felt like he was always the poor boy in a rich boy's space at Princeton as well as otherwise. We can also think of him as particularly the narrator here, right? That's part of his role here. And as such, we have to consider his point of view. Remember, this is a modernist text. And thus, we need to think about the conventions of narrators in modernist texts, which include them being unreliable. There being a fragmented narration. And there being some kind of reflection here, which we know because Nick's critique and Nick's evaluation of what happened across a couple of weeks, and particularly even a couple of weekends over one summer in 1922, are actually all told after Gatsby is dead. Remember, Gatsby turned out all right in the end. It was the foul dust that preyed on him, etc., etc. So we know from the first couple of paragraphs that Gatsby's already dead by the time this story is being told. And thus we have this kind of reflective frame narrative here. And we'll talk much more about what that is a little bit later. But thinking about Nick's role, why is he telling this story rather than Gatsby, rather than Tom, rather than Daisy, rather than Jordan even, or Maya Wolfsheim, someone else who is much more involved with the story? He is kind of an outsider. And we'll look at perhaps why that may be in this as well as other texts here. Rena, thinking about admiring Gatsby's hope and ambition. Very good. He is, as he says to Gatsby's father, a very close friend to Gatsby, and as such, he is sympathetic to what Gatsby wants. Tom never is. Maya Wolfsheim maybe is. We don't hear from people like Dan Cody because he is long dead. And we barely even hear from Gatsby's own family here. We certainly don't hear anything of his mother at all. We don't even know if she's alive. We presume not if she doesn't come to the funeral. But we don't know. And with this as well, we can also think of him as complicit. And complicit both in Gatsby's schemes, for example, the plot to get Daisy back, as well as to Gatsby's destruction, right? And ultimate condemnation. Because we know that Nick knows more than Gatsby does about how this is all going to shake out. And he eventually does know that it is Tom who is going to tell Wilson about who supposedly ran Myrtle Wilson over. and thus he knows more, and so he's complicit on both sides. He can see that Gatsby will never access what he wants, and he also still roots for him and tries, as he says, to kind of undermine this whole system by saying you're worth more than the whole rotten bunch of them, right? And we can see as well, he's an outsider to a certain extent at the beginning. He's sort of this liminal figure in a way who doesn't quite fit in East Egg, but also doesn't really fit in West Egg. And we see that he undergoes a transformation as a result of his experience with Gatsby, such so that at the beginning of the novel he says this made him temporarily lose interest in humanity, because he's so disillusioned by the experience of watching Gatsby be destroyed. We know as well he is a former soldier in the First World War. We know that he's a bond salesman. He's coming east to learn the trade. We know he's a Midwesterner, like all of these other characters are originally. We know that he has a romantic connection to Jordan Baker. We know potentially that we can analyze his romantic interests in a different way, perhaps through queer theory. And we can take a look at elements of masculinity, power, dominance, his kind of similarly to Mitch, if you've joined us for our Streetcar Named Desire series. Mitch to Stanley is the power dynamic really between him and Tom Buchanan. So this is enough for us to get started, right? We also need to think about Nick's name. And there are a couple of different elements to think about. What do you notice with Nick's name? Particularly thinking about the fact that Fitzgerald was extremely intentional with names here. Feel free to type into the chat and join us here. Well, firstly, we've got this idea of Carraway. Let's start there, because that really is where things stand out here. It sounds ordinary. His name sounds ordinary. Yeah, it's Nick, right? So Nick Carraway. That sounds like a realistic name. Rena, absolutely. Ordinary name. And why might that be? Perhaps to speak to his mundane, rural background. And we know he says his family has this kind of belief, or perhaps, Miranda, thank you for joining us. This is the first comment I've seen of yours. So perhaps, yes, double check that you've got your what you need sent through to us, because I definitely want to check your answers as well and acknowledge your contributions. We have him saying, we have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buckley, but the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in 51, sent to substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. We know he's from the Midwest, 3 generations as well. So this idea of his name fitting as the normal one surrounded by dramatic and wealthy people. Yes. So this element of grounded, perhaps provincial, which means more country, small town, provincial beliefs, values, etc. So yes, interestingly there. And this makes sense as well with what we think Carraway could be a play on caraway, a plant, particularly known for its seeds here. Could this be a link to the Midwest, which is particularly a rural background? And if he's got a hardware business, linking to this idea of the Midwest and his roots Yes. Interestingly as well, with caraway seeds, we've got that they have most famously medicinal properties in that they help with digestion in particular. And perhaps this links to this idea, as Rena said, of the normal one. He is like the one who is able to be truthful. He's able to provide medicine or a kind of antithesis or a truth to Gatsby's idealism, to Tom and Daisy's carelessness. Perhaps he is, again, this tonic compared to the alcohol-fueled or hope-fueled idealism of other people. Interestingly as well, Carraway symbolically can link to faithfulness. And we can analyze this in terms of faithfulness to ideals, to the truth. Remember, he says he is an honest person. To Gatsby, perhaps, when he says, I found myself on Gatsby's side and alone. Can we think about this as well as ironic? Because is he really faithful to anything, or does he change his mind, give up, betray Gatsby in a way, betray his values, leave the East entirely, etc.? It's close to carrying away. Willow, you're absolutely not stretching it too far. We can definitely break this down as well to care away. So again, thinking of the different elements of this. Is he someone, he says, who is confided in with secrets and problems? Yes. Or can we say that he is fundamentally someone who is careless, like Tom and Daisy, but similarly to them, unwilling to see it in himself? He can call it out in other people, but perhaps and Daisy, but perhaps he can't identify it in himself. Certainly, certainly. Interestingly as well, we can think of, and just to return to caraway seeds for a moment, this idea of medicinal properties. Caraway seeds are quite bitter. So thinking of this perhaps as the truth being bitter, him being left with this bitterness as a result of his disillusionment. It's interesting to think about, for sure. With Fitzgerald, I think you can't go too far in terms of analysis. And then finally, just to play with Nick briefly. Nick, yes, normal name, normal person, quite friendly, right? He's never Nicholas. It's always in nickname for Nicholas, short for Nicholas. So thinking about this kind of friendliness, the intimacy that he claims he has with everyone. Again, that kind of good Midwestern boy idea. As well as thinking about the idea that old Nick is referenced in Petronius's Satyricon, which is a Roman text, which we think, okay, that might definitely be a stretch, until we realize that this is the same place that references Trimalchio, which, if you've joined us for our previous lessons, Trimalchio in West Egg was the original title of the text. Trimalchio being a Roman former enslaved person who makes a fortune as a wine merchant and throws lavish parties where live birds are sewn into cooked pigs and things, extremely lavish, money based from alcohol, and thinking about him as this kind of mocked figure in Roman literature. And also thinking about, if that's the case, and we know that Fitzgerald knows Trimalchio to the point where he was going to call this Trimalchio, then we can say perhaps that he's also aware of another figure in Satyricon, which is Old Nick, which is the reference for the devil or Satan, who is, in this story, a liar. He's a liar and he's untrustworthy. So that then links to this idea of him perhaps being dishonest or unreliable. Or perhaps undercutting this very generous description he gives of himself and his honesty. Rena, Nick can also mean a small flaw or a cut which reflects the imperfections in Nick's honesty and morality. Yes, so perhaps that links to this idea of the dishonesty, the unreliability from the Satyricon as well, for sure. Absolutely. Any other ideas here? This is such a great start for thinking about Nick Carraway. It gives us such an impression already. Now let's take a look at his initial presentation and just put what stands out to you about this, right? Because we've certainly got some interesting points that are brought here. And this is not only the introduction to Nick, but also the first few paragraphs of the text itself. Because, of course, Nick is our narrator, and he begins by talking about himself and a reflection about his own character that I think is very revealing for talking about the character as well. So I'm going to read it so that you can hear it and put into the chat anything that stands out to you, okay? Even if you just like it explained slightly more. In my younger and more vulnerable days, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way, and I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person. And so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician, because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently I have feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least the terms in which they express themselves, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. I am still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decencies is parcelled out unequally at birth. And, after boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last summer, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness has nothing to do with that flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of the creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness, such as I have never found in any other person, and which is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. My family have been prominent, well-to-do people in this Midwestern city for 3 generations. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the Duke of Buccleuch. But the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in 1951, sent a substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. So put in the chat, what stands out to you here? What do you think is informative about Nick's character? People confide in him. He's privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men, Rena. 100%. Absolutely. Privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. They were unsought as well, right? So he wasn't going out looking for them. And describes this refusing to judge people, or trying not to judge people, as a matter of infinite hope. He is hoping that people mean well, that people are good, that when people reveal something about themselves, they are revealing some truth. Feel free to put other ideas in here. Interestingly as well, the self-criticalness here of, after boasting this way of my tolerance, the admission has a limit. So yes, I may be tolerant, but to a point. Can Nick be slightly representative of the author himself? I would say so, Miranda, because it does give this reflective element that seems at a distance to Gatsby as well, and perhaps speaks to the writer's own intention in presenting characters here, particularly characters like Gatsby or like Wilson, who are humanized in a way that previously wouldn't necessarily be the case in the same way. With this as well, how about Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn? So Gatsby, who represents everything I hate, everything I reject about life. Yikes, right? That says, okay, tolerance, reserving judgment. Says Gatsby was everything I hate. Willow, he sort of boasts without trying to make himself sound shallow, but quite informed towards the outer world. Yes, so he does seem reflective, as we said. He does seem, interestingly, when he said his younger and more vulnerable years, it sounds now like he's a much more reflective, disillusioned person. He doesn't sound like he is that young, vulnerable person anymore, impressionable person. He sounds like he's learnt something about life, perhaps the hard way. Here, his tolerance has a limit. That's him admitting he's not morally perfect as he wants to be. Does that make him trust him? Does that make us trust him more or less? That he admits his tolerance has a limit and that he doesn't like some people, and that sometime when people confide in him, he just pretends to be asleep or attempts to reject them, etc. She's somehow fed up with the rich mentality. Miranda, I think that's interesting. This idea that, yes, whatever it was with Gatsby, and remember, we don't know anything about Gatsby yet, because this is the beginning of the text, fundamentally changed him and made him uninterested in people's revelations any further. And interestingly as well, he is linking Gatsby with an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness he's never found in any other person and is not likely to ever find again. This sounds extremely disillusioned, right? I met this person who was the embodiment of hope, and I'll never find someone like Gatsby again. But only Gatsby was exempt as well. So interestingly, we have this Gatsby who he hates everything about what he represents, but also he is exempt from Nick's rules about people here. And interestingly as well, it seems that he does understand him and he does sympathize with him. This comparison to him being sensitive, attuned to hope, the promises of life, that's like an intricate machine that registers earthquakes. So not only are we thinking about a sensitivity to hope, but we're also aligning it to machinery here. So perhaps aligning it with the Industrial Revolution, with the development, with what Gatsby represents, this nouveau riche here as well. And so we have this dynamic then that's established, between Gatsby and other people Nick encounters, that immediately makes Gatsby seem not only sympathetic, but also transformational as someone to know. And Nick as someone who is seemingly trustworthy and honest and sympathetic, but also complex in his views here. Maybe Nick's admiration for Gatsby makes him unreliable. He exempts Gatsby from the judgment he applies to everyone else. So maybe his narration is emotionally biased from the start. Absolutely. Here, even the fact that Gatsby is exempt from his rules about other people seems different. Even this idea of Nick saying that he has limits and that he is no longer interested in people. Perhaps this does then suggest that he is blind in a way to Gatsby's failings, because he doesn't blame Gatsby in the end. Gatsby turned out all right in the end. It's what preyed on Gatsby, and thus introduces this idea of dust, foul dust, that's going to carry as a motif across the novel in the wake of his dreams. So then perhaps this idea of hope and disillusionment are immediately foregrounded at the beginning of this novel. Hope as linked with light, with machinery, with sensitivity, with beauty or gorgeousness, romanticism. And then dust, destruction, death, decay, disillusionment, all linked together as well as some kind of consequence for hope. And we also get this idea of the fact that if Gatsby's not dead, he's certainly not in the picture anymore, because his name is given to this book. We're speaking about him in the past tense. We're thinking about something preying on him, and thus him being the victim of this predator. And we're thinking about Nick never finding someone like him again. So this idea of this episode being finished. Interestingly, we set up this grandiose idea to start, and then we have Nick describing his family. My family has been prominent, well-to-do people for 3 generations. If you think about American society, this idea of establishment in America for generations, the inheritance of American culture is important. That establishes one's position in society to a certain extent, because it suggests that they have heritage in America, connection to America. Thinking of them as a clan, perhaps bringing these ideas from Europe, particularly places like Scotland, where clans or this interknit close group, but also links to this idea of elitism and history and ancestry here. But Nick also says we have a tradition we're descended from the Dukes of Buckley, but so immediately problematizing his own heritage again, because he's saying this is what people think, or this is what we believe about ourselves. This is our ancestry. But immediately collapses this, the way that Gatsby's own heritage is going to be collapsed over the course of the novel. Because Gatsby says something similar, right? I was in oil, I come from well-to-do people, I went to Oxford, etc. And though parts of those are true, it's also not true. But this idea of invention and meritocracy in American society. And it's also what it's based on. Came here in 51 on immigration and immigrant stories. Sent a substitute to the Civil War. As Rena says, that shows Nick's privileged background. Yes, but also shows the seedy, darker, manipulative underbelly of that privilege. In that, and this is real, by the way, not only for the Civil War, but also for the World Wars, where privileged upper-class people could avoid being drafted or going to war by sending a servant or a poor person in their place. So thus, essentially, buying their life back from the war effort and saying, well, it's fine, I don't have to go because, look, I've recruited someone who's vulnerable and doesn't have the privileges I do to go in my place. And thus war becomes a situation and a dynamic in which many more poor people are going to war. And when they do go to war, they're in far less privileged positions. They are on the front lines rather than as generals, majors, captains, etc., who are further back in the line, except in hand-to-hand combat. And interestingly, Rena says as well, this idea that Nick here is establishing his credentials. He's telling us about himself, and what is it that he finds important to tell us about himself? That he's honest, he's non-judgmental, he's changed, and that he's privileged. And thus, establishing these credentials, why do people establish their credentials? To make them seem trustworthy, right? So if he's going to talk to us about this world of class, he needs to show that he understands it. And it's important we hear this before we hear Gatsby or see Gatsby, because this description in this final paragraph aligns Nick with Daisy and Tom. So makes him part of this privileged set of people who are able to judge Gatsby because they are removed from Gatsby. Miranda, actually in the end, Gatsby's connection all seems fake. Can we think of him as well shallow, who don't pursue genuine connection? Interesting that you say that. Could we actually problematize it even further and say, okay, well, Gatsby's history was not true, but neither was Nick's. And neither was Biloxi's at Daisy and Tom's wedding. And who's to say that Daisy and Tom's heritage is real, right? Is it part of the American inheritance that people, given a fresh start, are able to make their own fate and their own history and thus invent their own past as well as their own future? So yes, Miranda, those ideas of Gatsby's connections, the way that Maya Wolfsheim pronounces it, perhaps is suggesting this idea of connections, links, heritage, ancestry, etc., is actually not really real for anyone. This wholesale hardware business, again, this is thinking about inheritance, business that's able to be passed through generations suggests success, and thinking of him as stable, right? And given the opportunity to advance beyond hardware to bonds and the bond sale and trade, suggests that they're socially mobile. Yes, they're already privileged, but he's now able to access even further, less provincial business spaces where bonds at this time in the Roaring '20s were a really quick and easy way to become extremely successful. Any other questions or ideas? Feel free to put into the chat by all means. Yeah. Okay. So now let's take a look at some arguments that we can make about Nick as a character. Now, these are by no means the only arguments one can make, but there's some interesting ways to think about Nick. So I've collected some quotations from across the text, organized for the most part in terms of narrative order, in terms of where they appear in the text, in other words, that allow us to think about Nick in a couple of different ways. So if you're thinking about Nick in terms of one of your set texts, so this is perhaps a way to think about generating new paragraphs. And if you're thinking about this Great Gatsby in terms of thinking about coursework, then this is a way to think about how you can draw connections to your other text, your comparative text, thinking about Nick in new and fresh ways. Like this idea to Blanche and the millionaire friend she was waiting for. Explain what you mean, Willow, a little bit more. I want to think about how you're thinking about that. Linking this to Nick and the bonds, to Nick and Gatsby, to Gatsby more broadly. Explain a little bit more in the chat and I'll see. So firstly, let's think about Nick as elitist and judgmental. We know he cares about class because he initiates this text. We're talking about his father not having all the privileges that he does, and seeming, despite his best efforts, as hypocritical, right? Saying, oh, I'm tolerant, I'm honest. Do tolerant and honest people necessarily brag about their honesty and tolerance and how good they are? Not necessarily here. And in this start, we saw Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. So thinking then of Gatsby as Nick as someone who looks down on Gatsby because of who he is. So Gatsby representing then what? The nouveau riche, new money, criminality, gaudiness, performativity, connections, rich people connections are ultimately tied to other lies in Gatsby's case and delusion, plus lies in Blanche. Yeah, interesting, Willow, thinking about that. Connections absolutely being important, these webs of societies and connections being linked to power. So Blanche's connections, that's why she talks about Shep Huntley. That would be a name that people in her society would recognize, and that's why she's saying it. She's trying to align herself with power. The problem is that when Gatsby does it, his connections are criminals, like Wolfsheim, like the people calling from Chicago, like something that needs to be kept clandestine, right? So he doesn't have the same connections as Tom would, which is why when he's with Tom at the party, he says, oh, Tom, the polo player, Miss Tom Buchanan, the polo player. He's trying to align himself with those connections, but we know that Tom will disavow Gatsby and won't be described the way that he's being linked. An unaffected scorn. So for someone who says that he's not judgmental, and remember, before you judge people, that they haven't had the same opportunities as you, or the advantages as you've had, he still rejects someone who hasn't had the same advantages as him. Someone who comes from shiftless farm folk and makes something of himself. And Nick Carraway thinks this as an imposition, as someone who should be looked at with scorn, with rejection, in other words. So is he any better here than Daisy, Tom, even Myrtle in her treatment of George Wilson. Similarly as well, everyone suspects himself of at least one of the cardinal virtues, and this is mine. I am one of the few honest people I've ever known. So thus this aligns what Nick says, his narration across the text. We need to be careful. Is he being actually fair, or is he a biased character who's giving a biased viewpoint? Can we resist this narrative? Can we be critical of this narrative? As Rena said, people who brag about honesty often aren't honest. So this idea then of, as soon as he says, oh, this is my cardinal virtue, even with that colon there, this idea, it really does sound really hypocritical and dishonest. To me, as a reader, I am immediately thinking, this person is dishonest. If someone is saying, I'm one of the few honest people I've ever known. His father seems like a snob. Agreed, Miranda. Yes, he is. And for that to be the second line in the text, really foregrounds this idea of criticism and advantage here, and the upper classes having this paternalistic view of the working class. And by paternalistic, I don't mean fatherly in a good way, like protecting someone, but I mean rather looking down on the power dynamic between a parent and a child, which is traditionally the power dynamic between upper classes and working classes, even in the upper classes' view of their responsibility or relationship to the working classes, was that the working classes to them were essentially children compared to their more evolved, more civilized society. So here we think of this. We don't have any other characters aligned with virtue here, other than if we think about Gatsby as aligned with hope here, which arguably is a virtue or is more so in this case destructive. And honesty carries on across the text. We have Nick as our narrator, but we have to problematize this with the unreliability of his narration. Exactly, Miranda. Same idea as that. And interesting here as well, we have the instant her voice broke off, ceasing to compel my attention, my belief, I felt the basic insincerity of what she had said. This is Nick talking about Daisy. So Daisy's voice then, linking to attention and belief. This is interesting because Daisy's voice is important across the text. Then you remember what her voice is aligned with when we think about how Gatsby in particular describes it and how Nick describes Daisy's voice. It's always really compelling. Rena, she's like a siren, right? And she says, or Nick says actually, that people believe that Daisy sort of murmurs and speaks in a low voice so that she can get people to lean in towards her. And so kind of drawn towards her as well. Money as well, Willow, yes. So Gatsby says she's her voice is full of money. Interestingly, Nick says she has an indiscreet voice, so a voice that's like immodest in some way. The third character, Nick, notices the emotional shifts that others might miss. Rena, interesting point here as well. So everyone else seems to be completely unquestioning about Daisy. Everyone's sort of caught under her spell, and it's Nick who says, she doesn't say what she means. She's just being fake here, in other words. Would Gatsby say this about Daisy? Certainly not. And as such, we start to think about what we would lose if Gatsby was our narrator. Would we be able to see this complex view of Daisy? No, we would only see her as this golden girl, green light, idealized vision. Here we already get the sense of doom here because she is fake. So when she's talking about love to Gatsby, we already have foregrounded for us the fact that she is performative. Now, we can argue that she is performative because women had to be performative in their roles in this time in society. But we can also think of immediately he is undercutting here. And this makes us trust him more, right? Whilst also thinking, again, he's being judgmental, right? He is thinking about other people as insincere. But is he sincere? Hard to say. But this idea of casting a spell, and then when she stops talking, then we feel this insincerity. So as long as she is carrying on this narrative and saying things in this throaty, moneyed voice, we're caught in the spell. It's only when she stops talking. Remember, she stops talking when she can't say that she never loved Tom. And after she gets in the car with Gatsby, we don't hear her voice again. So then the spell is broken, and we are left only with this basic insincerity. After that point, after the car crash, we don't hear her voice again, ever, in the text. This is about Myrtle then, when they go to New York with Tom. So with the influence of the dress, her personality had also undergone a change. Her laughter, her gestures, her assertions became more violently affected moment by moment. Affected means that she is putting on a behavior that's not natural to her. So she is pretending to be someone she's not. And in this case, Myrtle is pretending that she is like Tom and Nick, in that she is upper class. We know, Nick knows, because he presented her initially as wife of gas station attendant George Wilson, that she's not in the same class as Daisy, Tom, Nick. And so when, for example, Myrtle's sister says, well, it's only that because Daisy's Catholic that Tom won't divorce her and marry Myrtle. There is no way Tom is leaving Daisy to marry Myrtle. Not least because we, the audience, through Nick's presentation, can see Myrtle as failing in her attempt to access this upper class society. And this idea of her being violently affected, her personality undergoing a change, portrays her as hypocritical, but also unsympathetic and also foolish in this attempt to access something that she doesn't know about. So when she tries to say, oh, it's impossible to get good servants or good service around here, Nick, Tom, Daisy are aware that to them, Myrtle is the status of a servant. So her putting on these airs, these attitudes of the upper class, is actually a mockery of them. And they, Nick, Tom, Daisy, Jordan, mock Myrtle, essentially to her face, in a kind of smaller version of what they do to Gatsby. Because here Fitzgerald aligns Gatsby and Myrtle, in that, yes, Myrtle's is more extreme, but Gatsby is similarly as unsuccessful in trying to access what he's trying to access. Yes, he may have the money. Yes, he may have the power, but he's never going to fit into the society as well. Rena instantly decides Myrtle is fake, dramatic, and trying too hard. Exactly. And this makes him reject her further, right? And it's this idea that costuming, this influence of her dress, her personality, undergoes a change. This then speaks to the idea of clothing as well being important. Think of Gatsby, white suit, pink suit, gold tie, silver shirt, all the shirts that come flowing out of the wardrobe when he shows Daisy. It's not going to work. As Tom says, an Oxford man, like hell he is, he wears a pink suit. It's like, he's not. He couldn't possibly fit into that elite society because he is wearing clothes that prove he is not part of that society. Yeah, Willow, you could say that. I wouldn't say she's trying to escape the capitalist excess. I would say she's trying to access it. She wants to escape the Valley of Ashes and access more elite positions of society by trying to act it. But Nick's voice shows that she can't successfully do that. Interestingly as well, final things he says to Gatsby: you're worth the whole damn bunch put together. The last thing he says to Gatsby: I've always been glad I said that. It was the only compliment I ever gave him because I disapproved of him from beginning to end. Why do you think he would include this idea? Why would he say I disapproved of him from beginning to end when we know that something awful is going to happen to Gatsby based on the foreshadowing at this point? It seems like, though Nick is sympathetic to Gatsby, he knows, and seemingly everyone knows, that Daisy will never, just like Tom will never, leave Myrtle, or leave Daisy for Myrtle. Daisy will never leave Tom, this powerhouse of stability and success and safety and security in society, for Gatsby, whose ambiguous wealth will never fit in society. It just won't happen. The elite remains elite in their own eyes by staying insidious, by staying locked into their own group. They won't branch out. That's part of the point. Maybe Nick says he disapproved of Gatsby because of his lies and obsession with Daisy. Rena, yes, as well. He disapproved of what he was trying to do, either with Daisy, with his mansion and vulgarity, etc. It seems like it's partly that as well, right? That he disapproves of this gaudy mansion, his terrible clothes, the fact that he tries to make everything so insanely exotic and over the top. It's not sophisticated in a way that Nick approves of. Does this sound like, when you feel like criticizing, just remember all the people in the world haven't had the advantages you've had? No. But as well, interestingly, we think about the fact that this judgment and elitism does also change across the text, because Nick also says, after Gatsby's death, the East was haunted for me like that, distorted beyond my eyes' power of correction. So this idea that this disapproval of Gatsby, but also this link to Gatsby, ruins the whole East for him, what the East represents, what Gatsby represents. And he can't see beyond this disillusionment. So again, speaking to this idea that he is an unreliable narrator, if he is unable to see clearly the distance between Gatsby and the rest of the East. Maybe Nick is traumatized. Gatsby's death changes how he sees everything. Yes, Rena, I would say so. And especially if we're thinking about the motif of sight here, then this is important. This idea that Gatsby takes over the sight and fundamentally changes Nick's sight. We can also think of Nick as sympathetic. So as we said, he's privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. This idea, an intimate revelation, is quivering on the horizon. And that he doesn't really want these. In fact, he kind of rejects them. But this idea that there's something about Nick that makes him someone to confide in, which perhaps is why Gatsby is able to confide in Nick, because he thinks of him as someone who he's able to open up to here. Again, feel free to put into the chat anything that stands out making him feel unsympathetic. But this idea that perhaps he's trustworthy, right? These confidences, and that he can recognize that when one of these confidences is coming, and thus that he opens himself up to, or he's trustworthy in some way to Gatsby. And Jordan Baker clocks this as well when she says, I hate careless people. That's why I like you. So thinking of other people seeing Nick as careful, And with the play on his name, then we think of him Carraway. Is he someone that is caring? And is this a sustainable caring? Is he different from the carelessness of Daisy and Tom? Would Nick be an omniscient narrator or a narrator that focuses? I would say Willow, that he's an unreliable narrator. His description and the framing of it, and we'll get to that before the end of the lesson, is aligned to perhaps a third person omniscient narrator. But because he provides so much opinion, it's hard to say that he's omniscient, because we don't really know everything about what Gatsby's thinking, everything about what Daisy's thinking, everything about what Tom is thinking. And that's part of the mystery in the play here, isn't it? Is that we have Nick because we can't see those other characters. That's part of the clouding of their judgment, etc. Rena, I see what you mean. Jordan is saying this, though. That's why I hate you. I hate careless people. So Jordan is saying that she hates careless people, not Nick. So it shows he judges other. Well, certainly there is this idea of rejection of carelessness that we return to, because Jordan is shown to be careless. Nick, to a certain extent, is shown as careless. Daisy and Tom are definitely careless. Even Gatsby, when he is involved in Myrtle's death and doesn't do anything about it, can be considered careless as well, because he gets what he wants. He doesn't care about Myrtle being dead. He only cares about Daisy and getting what he wants. Nick as well, when Gatsby's being attacked about being an Oxford man, and Tom says to him, you must have gone to Oxford the same time that Bloxy went to Yale. So essentially, there's no way you went to Oxford, you're lying. You're a grifter, a fake, etc. And when Gatsby proves that he did go to Oxford as part of the offer after the armistice for officers, he says, I wanted to get up and slap him on the back. I had one of those renewals of complete faith in him I'd experienced before. So this idea that he wants Gatsby to win. He's rooting for Gatsby. And yes, he doubts him. Who wouldn't? Gatsby is an idea in a way. So it's hard to say that he is believable at all times. In fact, it seems like he's definitely not. But Nick returns and wants to support him. He wishes he could get up and slap him on the back. Does he? No. But he suddenly feels this feeling of complete faith, complete trust in Gatsby. Interestingly, however, this is contingent on proof. Nick is inconsistent, swings back and forth between disapproval and admiration. Rena, yes. But don't we all? Especially with someone as complicated as Gatsby, who seems to be lying half the time, or seems to be unconvincing or gauche in some way all the time. And we see as well in that next quote, they are a rotten crowd, I shouted across the lawn. You're worth the whole damn bunch put together. So thus, Nick exposes the rottenness of the upper class, of the Daisies and Toms and Jordans who reject Gatsby, and says they're not you're worth much more than all of them. I.e., I reject the hypocritical, judgmental upper class, and I root for you, and I see your value. Defends Gatsby, stands up against the cruelty of Tom and Daisy. Rena, I think this is a real indicator of his disillusionment with Tom, with Daisy, etc. And this is linked here to this next quotation, which is, I'll be damned if I go in. I'd had enough of them all for one day. And this is after they get back, once Myrtle's been killed, after they get back from that drive. And this idea of I'd be damned if as in, there's no way I'm going in. I refuse. But there's also this idea of I will be damned, as in I will be sent to hell or condemned if I go in. As in, if I do go in, I'm complicit and I'm part of them again. And I'm rejecting that. I'm rejecting being tarred with the same brush of this complicit, hypocritical, judgmental, and violent upper class. I'd have enough of it. So in rejecting going into the house, he's rejecting them and choosing instead Gatsby. And at the end, the final evaluation of Tom and Daisy, they were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together and let other people clean up the mess they had made. Could we argue he might have failed to see Gatsby's rottenness because he loved him? Willow, yeah, definitely. Yeah, he's biased, definitely. And that's part of him being an unreliable narrator, right? We can say, yes, he is privy to quite a lot of information about the characters, but his biases complicate his narrative as well, or occlude his narrative. Nick is morally outraged by the injustice. He sees the damage they cause. Rena, yes. Look at the damage. Smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money. So did damage and violence and harm and then are safe from it. And let other people clean up the mess. Who are these other people? Gatsby, Wilson, Nick himself. But interestingly as well. So he feels utter distance and clarity about Tom and Daisy. But he also knows they got away with it. And he doesn't do anything to stop them from getting away with it. So there as well, he is also complicit in this. As he says, I was within and without, simultaneously enchanted and repelled by the inexhaustible variety of life. This is so real as a way to describe Nick's liminality, and by that I mean he's sort of in an in-between, between the polar opposites of Gatsby and Tom and Daisy. He's within, he's inside and outside of these spaces. He is a transitory character, which is perhaps why he's the only one who changes. Gatsby, Tom and Daisy are static characters. Myrtle and George Wilson are static characters. Nick is the one who changes. Which is perhaps why we can say he's the protagonist. Because Gatsby is actually arguably quite a simple character. He is born poor, he wants something and he tries his hardest to get it and is killed as the result of it. Rena, he's torn, fascinated by the glamour but disgusted by the behaviour. Exactly. He's complicit with the privilege, but he's disillusioned by its consequences. Willow, Nick was also careless to an extent because he's complicit in Daisy, Tom, Myrtle and Gatsby's lies. Yes. Remember, he's also complicit in a lot of little lies, like, for example, the fact that he was engaged in the Midwest and broke that off as soon as he came, or sort of to escape that. God knows what that mess was that he left. He was writing letters, love Nick, to someone else. He was involved with someone from the office. And he sort of manages to escape stickiness with all of that. And also manages, despite being linked with Maya Wolfsheim, and Gatsby offers him some kind of role in his shady dealings, that he doesn't get involved. He manages to escape that by just being like, no, thank you. And he has the privilege to be able to do that, whereas someone who doesn't have money might not. The same with, I found myself on Gatsby's side and alone. So here then we have him choosing a side. This is after Gatsby is dead. And he's trying to take the funeral and the mourning into his own hands because, as he says, no one else is doing it. He's like a local outsider. Ultimately, he doesn't fit in with East or West Egg due to his views. Willow, due to he doesn't fit in one because of his upbringing. He doesn't fit in the other because of his views. Absolutely. Which is why perhaps he's always going back and forth between East Egg and West Egg. And interesting, he reveals as well the hypocrisy. He seems like this really moral character when he's setting up the funeral. and saying that he can, say he's the one who attends it, he's the one who organizes, he'll get someone for Gatsby, etc., and everyone else doesn't come. So people like Klipspringer, Daisy are revealed, and even Wolfsheim are revealed to be horrifically hypocritical in their love, attention, desire for taking advantage of Gatsby, no love. And this then finally culminates all these rumors about Gatsby, because this man in this third quotation, this he that they're talking about, is someone who Nick calls to invite to the funeral, and this person suggests that Gatsby had it coming. This is someone who used to attend his parties. And this idea of a certain shame for Gatsby. However, that was my fault, because he was one of those who used to sneer most bitterly at Gatsby on the courage of Gatsby's liquor. So here then thinking about all the people who were taking advantage of Gatsby's hospitality, his generosity, his riches, his position, his parties, etc., but also mocking him, also rejecting him, also not viewing him as a person, not accepting him, etc. And as Rena says, he feels guilty for judging Gatsby earlier, who's part of the crowd mocking him. But he also says, I have an unaffected scorn. I disapproved of him from beginning to end, right? So really, we have to consider the fact that Gatsby here is also mocked by Nick and disapproved of by Nick. So Nick seems to have the moral high ground until we remember that he's also continuing to say that he disapproved of him as well. Yes, he attends the funeral, but should he be the one with whom our sympathies lie, or should someone like Mr. Gatsby's father, who never has any pretensions beyond himself? Rena, perhaps he's also self-aware enough to recognize his own hypocrisy. Yes, arguably, absolutely. With this as well, I couldn't forgive Tom or like him, but I saw what he had done was, to him, entirely justified. So there we have Nick as still understanding Tom's actions in the fact that he betrayed Gatsby to Wilson, took care of his own problems by allowing himself to escape with Daisy, allowing Daisy not to take the blame for Myrtle's death, allowing himself to be able to sweep Daisy away from Gatsby by having Gatsby killed, and avoid blame for Myrtle running into the road, which was about him, because he was having the affair with Myrtle, which is why she was being locked up in the first place. All of that is taken care of by him telling Wilson about Gatsby instead. So Gatsby then becomes sacrificial, but Nick understands Tom's point that it was justified to him. Ends justify the means. He tries to see both sides, which makes him seem complicit. He understands Tom's logic, even though he hates him, Rena, which means that he understands the logic of an upper class that's willing to use its power and privilege to protect itself from justice and ensure injustice in the class hierarchy. Willow, or was it justified because they were rich and he felt the less affluent had to protect them? I think not that the less affluent had to protect him, but that the less affluent were able to be sacrificed for the protection of the upper class. That they were disposable in a way. Gatsby was disposable. Wilson was disposable. Myrtle was disposable. But Daisy and Tom are not, because they're important in society. They're valuable. And Nick as well, this is Tom saying this, he threw dust into your eyes, just as he did in Daisy's, but he was a tough one. So this idea that by the end of it, Tom gives Nick a way to think about Gatsby that will also blame Gatsby for Nick's behavior and Nick's disillusionment. Nick admits Gatsby deceived him but still admires him. Yes, this is an option for blaming Gatsby for everything. but also introduces again this idea of dust, right? Dust is linked, as I said, with disillusionment, with decay, with blindness, with destruction, with the tearing down of idealism and hope and the American dream. But it also clouds our judgment. So this idea of perhaps this again disrupts our understanding of the truth and the reality of the novel, because Nick here at the end is again being questioned in terms of his understanding of the reality of Gatsby's narrative. We can also think about Nick as realistic and the antithesis or the foil for Gatsby's idealism here. And here we can think about how Nick and his access to money, his hope to make money, he goes to a different source than Gatsby does. Gatsby takes unscrupulously, etc. Because he worked for everything he got, like Nick is trying to do with bonds. Willow, yes. But the difference, I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas and Morgan and Maecenas knew. So what does he do? He doesn't con and invent and involve himself in criminality. He buys books about institutions to do with money, and particularly safety to do with money, investments, right? There is risk there, but it's state-sanctioned legal ways to make money. And yes, from Nick, there is this element of idealism, like new money from the mint. So he's hoping as well, like Gatsby, to make money that his family previously didn't have. These shining secrets. So there's this promise and link to legendary figures like Midas, the touch of gold, but also Morgan, as in J.P. Morgan, as in Morgan Industries. So thinking about not only mythological gold and money and legendary money, but also titans of industry, and the same with Maecenas as well. Rena, he believes in practical, steady work, banking, finance, real careers grounded in reality and not fantasy. Yes, so unlike Gatsby, who swims out to a boat and takes his fortune with Dan Cody, but also gets cheated out of most of it, gets involved with Maya Wolfsheim and is potentially involved in bootlegging, gambling, gangster, gun running, extortion perhaps. All of these different elements, that reference to Chicago being on the line, if we're thinking about what's being suggested about Gatsby, that's a reference to Al Capone and gangsters and gun running and bootlegging, etc., because that's how Al Capone made his money, tax fraud, etc. So that's very different from learning about bond trades and making money with a little bit of risk, but in the roaring 20s, much more of a guarantee. Though, if we think about this as predicating the economic crash, of course, this book was published in 1925, so we can't say that he is actually foreshadowing the Great Depression, because it didn't happen yet when he published the book. He didn't know it was going to happen. You can't tell the future. But there's this idea of investing in all of these stocks, etc. But like the hopes, like with Gatsby, all of this can collapse as well. The only thing that is really stable is family inherited money, the way that Tom Buchanan has, where he has stables and Yale and infinite money, but it's from the Buchanan family. He brings 100 people to his wedding because that is his power there. Gatsby's library was fake. Willow, interesting there. Yes, Gatsby's library, the books were real, Owl Eyes thought they were fake, but they were proved to be real, but the books were uncut. So when you used to buy books, particularly fancier copies of books, the pages were printed so that they were on longer sheets that were then sewed in. So you didn't have one sheet for each page, but rather multiple sort of sections that were sewn together. And when you first bought these books, you needed a knife to cut open the sections that weren't cut yet. So I can try and show you a picture if that makes more sense. I can try and show you this. Yeah, here we go. So this idea here of the books being developed in sections. And so when Owl Eyes says they're uncut, this is what they mean, is that you actually need to slice them through because the pages aren't linked, which means, of course, that Gatsby hasn't read the books. Yeah? That's okay, Rena. Thank you for joining us. Please join us the following week for our lesson on Gatsby. This is the 4th of March. Okay, so yes. Next, we've got this, she's got an indiscreet voice. Her voice is full of money, he said suddenly. So this idea of, yes, voice is full of money, but it's also indiscreet. And Gatsby has this idealistic view of what Daisy represents, whereas Nick is much more like her voice is a little bit too sultry and suggestive. It's almost too sensuous, as Jordan Baker says. And as well with this, unlike Gatsby and Tom Buchanan, I had no girl whose disembodied face floated along the dark cornices and blinding signs. So I drew up the girl beside me, tightening my arms. Her one scornful mouth smiled, and so I drew her up again closer, this time to my face. So this idea that he is directly contrasted with Gatsby and Tom Buchanan, who have this idealized, disembodied face floating before them like a beacon, like the green light. He just has the girl next to him, much more real. Doesn't matter as much. There's not this idealism. And he sees this in her one scornful mouth. So he sees her not just as this perfect idealized, but as a more complex character. Same for that. I wouldn't ask too much of her. One of the most famous quotations, you can't repeat the past. Why, of course you can, incredulously. So this idea that this isn't going to, you can't go back to 5 years ago. Things are different now. And Gatsby is unable to see, hear, believe this. And the contrast as well between Jordan and Daisy. So when we get to speak to Daisy, we'll see this contrast between her and Jordan as antithesis or as foil characters as well. Who is too wise to ever to carry well-forgotten dreams from age to age. So this idea that Jordan, like Nick, has left dreams in the past and is much more realistic than Daisy, Gatsby, even Tom are. And he says this as well, I'm 30, I'm 5 years too old to lie to myself and call it honor. So he says about himself that he can't lie to himself. He has to be realistic. Then thinking about the final part of the novel. So I'll just read this out. And again, whatever stands out to you is important here for showing how Nick has changed at the end or even stayed the same at the end. I see now that this has been a story of the West after all. Tom and Gatsby, Daisy and Jordan and I were all Westerners, and perhaps we possessed some deficiency in common, which all made us subtly unadaptable to the Eastern life. After Gatsby's death, the East was haunted for me like that, distorted beyond my eyes' power of correction. So when the blue smoke of brittle leaves was in the air and the wind blew the wet laundry stiff on the line, I decided to come back home. Gatsby's house was still empty when I left. The grass on his lawn has grown as long as mine. One of the taxi drivers in the village never took a fare past the entrance gate without stopping for a minute and pointing inside. Perhaps it was he who drove Daisy and Gatsby over to East Egg the night of the accident, and perhaps he had made a story about it all his own. I didn't want to hear it, and I avoided him when I got off the train. I spent my Saturday nights in New York because those gleaming, dazzling parties of his were with me so vividly that I could still hear the music and the laughter, faint and incessant, from his garden, and the cars going up and down his drive. One night I did hear a material car there, and saw its lights stop at his front steps, but I didn't investigate. Probably it was some final guest who'd been away at the ends of the earth and didn't know that the party was over. On the last night, with my trunk packed and my car sold to the grocer, I went over and looked at that huge, incoherent failure of a house once more. On the white steps, an obscene word, scrawled by some boy with a piece of brick, stood out clearly in the moonlight. And I erased it, drawing my shoe raspingly across the stone. Then I wandered down to the beach and sprawled out in the sand. Most of the big shore places were closed now, and there were hardly any lights except the shadowy, moving glow of a ferry boat across the sound. And as the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away until gradually I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh, green breast of the New World. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. And as I sat there brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgiastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms further, and one fine morning... So we beat on, boats against the current, borne ceaselessly back into the past. Apologies. Okay. Well, we have Nick really giving Gatsby's elegy here. This has been a story of the West, something that doesn't suit this Eastern life. The East being haunted for Nick going forwards. He couldn't face these same tales of Gatsby that we hear all the way across the text. He avoids the parties that he could remember. He can't face it. He goes over and looks at the house, but of course he still calls it a huge, incoherent failure of a house here. But he erases the obscenities and looks out across the text there and thinks about Gatsby as aligned with the colonizers who arrived to Long Island as part of Europeans' colonization of America. And think about this idea of Gatsby's trajectory to this blue lawn, but also reflecting that he had done something that was already failed, was attempting something that had already failed for him, and knows what Gatsby believes. This idea of hope continuing, but cut off here, and then thinking about continuing, Nick continuing this, but then being born back ceaselessly into the past. And this is the final line of the text. So thinking of, okay, but we expect it to be future, right? Born ceaselessly into the future, but we're returning to the past. This idea of cyclicality, return, even perhaps failure and disillusionment being our final idea of the text. So Nick then fundamentally as changed, still as judgmental, as disillusioned, as sympathetic here, but still as complicit as one of the survivors, whereas Gatsby is unable to survive. And finally, we need to think about, yes, Gatsby's story disillusions Nick Willow, absolutely. Yes. And then thinking about Nick's role in The Great Gatsby, well, this is the framing of the narrative here. In the middle, we have what we find out at a couple of places piecemeal across the text. Before 1922 and quote-unquote the truth. Gatsby as Jimmy Gats, poor-born fisherman, mysterious bootlegger, and nouveau riche success. That is the nugget of this story, right? That in its simplest form. This is the Bildungsroman of Jimmy Gats becoming Jay Gatsby. Then we have, outside of that, the summer of 1922. So the time when this summer takes place, when Nick meets Gatsby, etc. Where Gatsby's life as Jay Gatsby is at its pinnacle, and the second romance with Daisy, where they are reunited. And then we must return to this idea that Nick's narration of this summer takes place roughly 2 years later, as he admits at one point in the text. It's been 2 years since all of this happened. So then thinking of Nick as someone who embodies distance, someone who embodies reflection, someone who embodies judgment, but connection, distance, and absolution, as well as disillusionment fundamentally. If this were just the story of the summer of 1922, we wouldn't understand the depth of complexity and tragedy of a couple of weekends encounters between some people of different classes. If we didn't have the truth, we wouldn't understand the trajectory of Gatsby and how it aligns with the understanding of America and the American dream. And if we didn't have Nick's distance, we wouldn't understand that this hope is doomed and the loss of the idealism of the American dream at the end. And if we were thinking finally about a couple of ideas, Maxwell Perkins, who was Fitzgerald's lifelong editor and friend, wrote to him in 1924. Remember, The Great Gatsby was published in 1925, but Fitzgerald submitted a version that he thought would be direct to publishing in 1924, and Perkins made significant edits at a very late stage in the editing process that really did change the structure of the text. And Perkins says this: "You adopted exactly the right method of telling it, that of employing a narrator who is more of a spectator than an actor. This puts the reader on a point of observation on a higher level than that on which the characters stand, and at a distance that gives perspective. In no other way could your irony have been so immensely effect." So thinking of the fact that irony, perspective, observation, and spectatorship are all fundamental parts of the importance of this text and the importance of Nick. So feel free to put in the text, if you in the chat, if you agree with this, that Nick is much more a spectator than an actor in these stories, and that we need this distance of perspective in order to understand Gatsby as a character and the other characters as characters. And finally, if we think about how we can use this, if we get an example of a question on Nick, or on narration, or on protagonists even, we can think about Nick's role here in terms of discerning the truth, in terms of offering perspective, in terms of thinking about complicity and judgment and acceptance and sympathy for Gatsby, even of liminality in thinking about Gatsby and how Nick serves as an important go-between between these two worlds. That brings us to the end of our lesson. Willow said, the distance is good, but it's unfair towards all the other characters who are unfairly represented. Yeah, definitely. And maybe that speaks to this idea that this is an unfair society, right? And whoever survives is the people who get to speak. Gatsby doesn't get to tell his own story. Neither does Myrtle. Neither does Daisy. Because they don't have the privilege in society to do so. The people who do are Nick, who escapes, for the most part, unscathed, materially unscathed. Absolutely. This does bring us to the end of our lesson. I hope you found this useful. I hope you found it interesting to add and supplement your understanding of The Great Gatsby. We will have a break next week, so we won't be streaming next Wednesday, but please do join us for our next stream, which will be on the 4th of March, and will be on Jay Gatsby. And then after that on Daisy, as well as a bunch of different themes to consider in your study of The Great Gatsby. Feel free to put any other questions in the chat, but other than that, we will be finishing here, and I look forward to having you join us again. Bye for now. Bye.